Okay. What is the event that kicks off the nullification crisis? Yeah, it's that tariff of abominations, and that was passed when? Yeah, 1828. Interesting question for you. Who is the president in 1828? It's still Quincy Adams, right? Jackson is elected in 1828, but when do we hold elections in the United States? In November. And when does the president take office? Well, these days it's in January, then it was in March. It's not that important. It's the following year, right? So the president doesn't take office until the following year. So Quincy Adams is still the president. And interestingly, did Jackson like the tariff? No, he hated it. He thought it was a horrible idea. Remember, he doesn't like the American system. He doesn't think the national government should be doing these things to benefit one, rich elite section of the country. Jackson doesn't even like the tariff. In fact, it's a complicated story. The tariff of abominations was part of like a ploy to try to hurt Quincy Adams. It worked, but then Jackson stuck with it, right? So the tariff of abominations, and what is so abominable about it? Okay, it's a tariff, but it's what kind of tariff? This is a stupid answer. It's really high, right? It's a really high tariff, way higher than anything else that we had passed. So tariff of abominations is really high, and people are mad about it. So what happens next? Yeah, so John C. Calhoun does what? So he's from where? South Carolina, and he does what? People riled up. Yeah, he presides over a convention that creates a document. It's a convention in South Carolina. What's the document called? No, it's called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Okay, so this is a document that's created, and it sort of advances two big theories. The first theory is what? I mean, this is called the what kind of crisis? So the first theory is about nullification. They suggest that the state of South Carolina, or that any state, could nullify a law if it's not in the interest of that state. That's completely unprecedented. We've never heard anybody suggest that before, have we? Yeah, we have. Okay, when? The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions suggested that, right? They had a little bit different logic. They said that we could nullify a law if it was unconstitutional, so that theirs is a bit more restrained than this idea we can just nullify any law we want. But still, there's a little bit of precedent here. So they're suggesting we can nullify the law, and then, well, yes, City Direction does get mad. They also raise the issue of secession. Now, they don't vote on it. They just talk about it. And in that document, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, they just include a lot of language like, should the national government choose to pass laws that are detrimental to the interests of the states, then the states really have no place in that union at all. So they're like flirting with the idea of secession, but they don't go that far. So then what happens next? Well, you said Andrew Jackson gets mad. Why is he mad? He doesn't even like the tariff. It's disunion. He feels like it's, disrespectful. Like, how dare the state of South Carolina talk about nullifying a federal law? Like, don't they respect federal authority? I don't know. To me, it's sort of like incongruous, because Jackson really is like just chooses the philosophy that fits him. Like, he's acting like a big federal government person when he campaigned on being a state's. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But he's really mad. Here's what makes him really, really mad, y'all. Who's John C. Calhoun? He's a sitting vice president. John C. Calhoun is Andrew Jackson's vice president, but that's totally unprecedented. We have never seen a sitting president go off and protest against a national policy, have we? Ooh, it was Jefferson, right? So what was the law that was passed then? It was the Alien and Sedition Act. You remember back during John Adams' presidency? And Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, and Jefferson went off with Madison and wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions we were talking about that suggested nullification in the first place. So no, it's not that unprecedented, but Jackson's horrified. He's really angry, and he takes things pretty personally. I mean, he's well known for like getting into duels and killing people. So he's incensed. So what happens? Henry Clay's trying to save the day. What did he do? Yeah, they make a new tariff, the tariff of 1832. And this one's lower. How does South Carolina respond? You're one step away from that, Shiva. That's sort of the end. So South Carolina's still mad. And at the Columbia Convention in South Carolina, they're going to hold a conference about secession. Right? So they're going to hold a conference saying, you know what, maybe the secession thing, maybe we got to do it. Here's the thing. None of the other southern states are like interested in seceding. So South Carolina's going it kind of lonely here. And they're ultimately realizing this is probably a bad plan. Like if the whole South secedes is maybe one thing, but just South Carolina, that's kind of comical, you know? So they're sort of looking for a way out. Luckily, Henry Clay, here he comes. But before Henry Clay can solve the problem, Andrew Jackson is crazy and demands what? Yeah, so Jackson demands that Congress pass the force bill. What is the force bill going to authorize him to do? Yeah, so it's going to authorize like military action against South Carolina. So like he could like march the military into the state of South Carolina, forcibly enforce the tariff, like you know, like take over all their customs houses. That's a little dramatic, don't you think? You know, for like the army of the national government to enter it. That's probably, oh, I don't know, Civil War style or something. Bad plan. So here comes Henry Clay. He goes, all right, we're going to solve it. And they pass the compromise tariff, which takes the 1832 tariff and then gradually lowers it until it gets to the pre-1828 levels. So it takes that 1832 tariff that we had already passed and says, okay, we're going to start here, but we'll put it into law that every year we're going to lower the tariff until it gets back to the way it was before the tariff abominations. Right, because 1832 was lower than the tariff abominations, but still was higher than it had been before the law. Right, so this is the compromise. And so what does South Carolina do? Well, they're kind of like cool. So South Carolina, remember, they're sort of feeling lonely after nobody shows up. You know, the Columbia Convention is that nobody wants to secede with them. So South Carolina, they accept the compromise, but but then in their final, like before they disband the Columbia Convention, they pass one more resolution which nullifies the force bill. It's a little bit like the Declaratory Act, you know? Like the British had the Stamp Act and we got really mad and we protested and so like we forced them to repeal it, but like they got to get that little jab in, you know? So it was like, well, we can do what we want. Well, South Carolina was sort of the same way. They back off. They're not going to secede. That's a bad plan. They're all by themselves. They accept the compromise bill, but they have to like jab back. But we're going to nullify the Force Act. That was not okay, you know. But Andrew Jackson lets it go, sort of miraculously, and that's kind of how the nullification crisis comes to an end. Why was this so important to South Carolina? I mean, nobody liked the tariff, right? The tariff raises prices for everyone, but why was the South so upset about it? Hold on, go ahead. Right, so it's called a retaliatory tariff. So everybody has to pay higher prices, right, when the tariff is passed. That's like the result. But the South was especially affected because not only did they have to pay higher prices, but remember the South rely on exports, right? They have to sell their cotton to the British. That's where they get all of their money. And in response to our tariff, it's very common that other countries, in this case Britain, will place something called a retaliatory tariff. So the British are mad at us for placing a tariff on their goods, so they place a tariff on our goods. And that hurts the South in like a significant way, right? Because now they're going to have trouble selling their goods. So that's why they're so mad. But why secession? Like, this isn't that dramatic, you know, it's just an economic policy. Like, why not just elect somebody new and get a new law passed? Why is this such a big deal to the South? And in many ways foreshadows the Civil War, even though this isn't about slavery at all. I heard somebody whisper states' rights. That's part of the deal. Did the South like this law? But did it get passed anyway? Even though they had a balance in the Senate, right? Remember the Missouri Compromise picked that balance? And it passed anyway. So there's a real concern in the South that the days are coming quickly that laws will pass that the South hates, and the South won't be able to stop it. And that's a little bit apocryphal, like it's probably not going to get that bad because they are going to keep the balance in the Senate. This is a special case because some of the western states wanted the tariff, and so even though they were slave states, they voted for it. But the South is really sort of freaked out about this idea that laws could pass Congress without the South's vote. And so for them, this is a line in the sand. We have to make sure that the North can't just pass the laws that it wants without us, because that could be bad. Because remember, like, setting aside the morality of slavery, and we can't, right? Slavery is immoral, so we can't forget that. But even if we weren't concerned about the morality of slavery, for the South, it is their economic livelihood. Like, their entire economic system is based on plantation-based agriculture. And to be honest, after the Civil War, when slavery goes away, the South's economy is, like, all screwed up. The South is not an economic power in the country until, like, World War II. Okay, so from 1865 to World War II. The South is mired in poverty and stagnation. They really struggle. Like, it's not a joke to say the South needed slavery, or felt like it needed slavery, to be economically successful. And so this is a life or death issue for the South, this notion that they would not have control over laws. Because today it's tariffs, tomorrow it could be slavery, and that's the end of the world. Right? So that's really like where it starts. So, okay, let's set that aside for the moment and talk just briefly about the bank war. Remembering that, so the nullification crisis happens in Jackson's first term, really. But in his second term, or leading into his second term, we see the rise of the bank war. So Henry Clay is in Congress, and he wants to get rid of Andrew Jackson. He thinks Andrew Jackson's a bad guy and horrible for the country and so on. So Henry Clay has a plan. He says that now the Second Bank of the United States had a charter. Remember, it was created in 1816, and its charter was supposed to last until, I can't remember, 1836, I think. Whatever it was. Its charter was supposed to last for several more years. But in 1832, when Andrew Jackson is coming up for re-election, Henry Clay says, you know what, I think we can make this an election issue. So Clay puts forward a bill to recharter the bank, even though it's early, right? Like, he could have waited several more years before he tried to recharter the bank. But he pushes forward a bill, let's recharter the bank now in 1832 to make it an election issue. Because Jackson's going to have two choices, right? He can either sign the bill, right? They recharter the bank, Jackson signs the bill, and Jackson will make his own supporters mad, right? Jackson's been campaigning against the bank almost the whole time he's in office. Or Jackson can veto the bill, and Henry Clay thinks that for sure if Jackson vetoes the bill, that will be political suicide also, because he'll lose all the support of the West and the North, who are benefiting from the stable credit policies of the bank. So Clay thinks it's a win-win situation. Unfortunately for Henry Clay, he calculates wrong, not because he's wrong about the issues, but because he forgets how political people can be. Like, most people who are voting don't actually care about the issues or aren't thinking about them. They're swayed by this new emotional style of campaigning that Jackson is doing. And so the issue ends up being not the thing that Clay thought that it would be. In the end, Henry Clay successfully gets the bill passed through both houses of Congress. Jackson chooses to veto the bill, and he gets reelected anyway. So now Jackson gets reelected. So now here we are, 1832. Jackson is reelected. And Jackson is going to take this moment as a mandate. So that means Jackson's going to say, listen, I vetoed that bank and I got reelected. Therefore, that must mean that the public supports me. The public agrees the bank is a bad idea. So even though he vetoed the bank, is the bank gone? No, because the bill was just a recharter and it was early, right? The bank still has several more years left in its term, and theoretically, the Congress could have tried again, right? While it still had time, the Congress could have passed a new bill in the future, rechartering it. They had plenty of years left. Theoretically, that could have been fine. But Jackson says, oh no, I got reelected. The public supports me. I don't want to just veto the bank bill. I'm going to kill it. There's actually an interesting quote. Jackson says, the bank tried to kill me, but I will kill it. And so instead of just letting the bank sort of expire peacefully, just waiting until its charter ends, Jackson begins to withdraw federal money from the bank. Now remember, the Bank of the United States is the bank for the U.S. government, but it also serves some private interests, right? It also has some private banking that it does. So what Jackson's doing is withdrawing all the federal money from the bank. Well, what does that do to the bank? Yeah, it makes it really poor. It takes away its capital. And that means the bank has no choice but to call in loans, right? Like it has loaned out money privately to different people, but it has to call those loans in. It's going, listen, we're out of money. Like the government took its money away. You got to pay us back right now. You know, you can't wait 5 years. I can't wait for you to take out more. Like I need you to give us the loan right back now. So all of a sudden, immediately we see a contraction in credit, right? So short term, he's taking money out of the bank, and there's less credit available. So a whole bunch of people who were counting on the U.S., the national bank, to like help fund their projects, all of a sudden are out of credit. They're not able to borrow that money anymore. But hold on, what does Jackson do with the money he takes out of the federal bank? He puts it in state banks, right? The so-called pet banks. So certain state, not every state, but certain states that were loyal to Jackson, Jackson puts his money in those banks. And when he does, what do they do with it? Right, the same thing they'd been doing before the bank, right? Remember what we talked about, how much we needed the bank because the states were like unregulated and loaning all however much money they wanted and like inflating the currency and stuff? Well, the state banks go right back to that. So we went from a credit shock, right at first, the national bank has to call in their loans, so we see a contraction of credit. And now Jackson gives money to the banks, and pretty soon those pet banks are loaning out a whole bunch of money. So now we see a credit surplus. Well, neither of those things are good, but going from one to the other is really, really bad, right? And so then we see the Panic of 1836, right? Speculation ensues in the West because of all of these loans the state banks are making. The speculation bubble bursts, and now all of a sudden we see deflation and all kinds of problems in the West because nobody can afford to pay for anything. Jackson tries to solve the problem. He realizes inflation is a problem, so he issues that specie circular, basically saying, like, you can't buy land in the West without hard currency. But that doesn't even work because there is no hard currency in the West, so it doesn't solve the problem that nobody can buy anything. And really everything just falls apart. But Jackson's not sad because he's all done, right? 2-term precedent. He's not gonna run for a 3rd term of office, so he leaves. He's off in the sunset. And his successor, Van Buren has to deal with the problem. Jackson gets to leave untarnished with his reputation. Nobody realizes that this is all his fault, or at least nobody but Henry Clay, and Henry Clay is not being listened to. Well, I mean, the economy is growing really quickly anyway, right? This is the market revolution. So when people have available credit, what are they going to buy? I mean, if you're not a farmer buying farm equipment, you're going to buy land. So that's the thing that credit goes to. And that bubble bursts really quickly because of this big shift. We go from a credit crunch to this too much credit and inflation to deflation, and it just becomes a big problem. So anyway, it becomes Van Buren's problem. But it's this event that really formally ends the era of good feelings. First of all, was the era of good feelings really full of good feelings? Not exactly, right? I mean, the Missouri Compromise, the first hint that we're going to have sectional crisis, that happens in the era of good feelings, right? Only one party, but still plenty to fight about. We'd have the nullification crisis during the so-called era of good feelings. So it's not like we'd been all unified anyway, but there had only been one party. But in the fallout from the bank war, a new party called the Whigs formed. It's an allusion to the American Revolution time, and the Whigs had been in favor of reasonable government. Anyway, they're trying to associate themselves, whatever. But the Whigs are going to be formed. Henry Clay will be their leader. And they're going to basically charge that Andrew Jackson, he calls himself a people's president, but actually he's acting like a king. And one of their biggest arguments is, look, who passed the bank bill? Congress. And who elected Congress? The people. So the people who elected Congress, their will was passed. They decided they wanted this bank bill. And then Jackson vetoed it. Why? Because the people said so? No, because he wanted to. All by himself, regardless of the fact that Congress was perfectly within their rights, right? Because is Jackson saying the bank is unconstitutional? No, he can't. McCulloch v. Maryland already said it was constitutional. So Jackson isn't talking about constitution. He's just doing public personal preference. So all by himself, just because he wants to, he's vetoing this law that the people's representatives passed. So the Whigs are going to say that's very king-like. That's not democratic at all. Jackson is going to say that the legislature was doing a bad job representing the people, and that the people really didn't like the bank, and therefore he was doing the right thing. But anyway, this is sort of the rallying cry of the Whigs. Do you have something quick?
I was just curious, why didn't they try to impeach him?
Well, there's not a lot of political will to do that. And the Democrats have significant support in the House and the Senate, sort of riding on Jackson's coattails. So this two-party system then is going to pit the Whigs against the Democrats. Fundamentally, the difference is that the Whigs believe the government should be involved in the economy, and the Democrats believe that it shouldn't, right? So Jackson and the Democrats are going to fundamentally argue for a laissez-faire government, right? Hands off, let the economy function, let the states do what they want to do, let businesses do what they want to do, leave small farmers alone, let banks do what they're going to do, like just leave everybody alone. The interesting exception to that is the nullification crisis, right? Because obviously that didn't go the way people thought. But anyway, that's how it starts. And then the Whigs are going to argue, no, we need the American system. We need the government to help protect the economy. We need orderly growth. We want the government to pass reasonable regulations to make sure that we can grow. So that's really the big difference. So then can you just tell me, inferring from that, who are some Whigs? Not names of people, obviously Henry Clay, but what kinds of people are Whigs? Northerners, rich people, businessmen, bankers, plantation owners, right? Not only do plantation owners want an orderly economy, they also hate Jackson, right? Plantation owners are really mad at Jackson after this whole nullification crisis thing. So plantation owners tend to be Whigs, at least for a while. Also, our Whigs are religious-y people, so most Protestants in general. It's a long story, but Jackson is seen as being kind of crude and immoral. So he supports this tainted woman. It's a long story. It's called the Peggy Eaton affair. And he curses a lot in public. His parrot was ejected from his funeral because the parrot was cursing at the funeral. That's a true story. And he kills people in duels. So the religious community doesn't like him. And then the Democrats are mostly small farmers, some immigrants. So the people who feel like the government isn't in their favor, people who aren't interested in the government getting involved in the economy, they don't see they benefit from that. So that's kind of how we end up at that two-party system. Any questions? Sir? Well, because he's really good at campaigning, right? So just like he manages to win his first term by talking about how the government is against the people. I mean, truly, Jackson is very Trumpian, the way that Trump wins is in many ways analogous to the way that Jackson wins. There are people who support Trump for whom President Trump's own ideas aren't really that beneficial, right? President Trump's arguing for certain, he wants tax cuts for the wealthy, and lots of his supporters are blue collar factory workers who are suffering from globalization. His policies are not going to help them, but he convinces them that he's their champion. He convinces them that the existing government wasn't on their side, that they've been cheated and screwed over by the people in power, and they need somebody new, somebody like them. So a lot of people like President Trump because he speaks the way he does. He's not politically correct, and he's a little bit crude, and people kind of well, at least he speaks his mind. He's not politically correct. People saw Jackson in much the same way. He's somebody like us. He's not one of those fancy, super educated people who knows all this stuff. He's like us and talks normal or whatever. And he just becomes very popular. And this is the time of popular America. In the 1830s, you guys, what else was there to do? There's no television. There's no radio. People talk about politics. When a politician comes to town to give a speech, people will line up and listen to 4-hour speeches and then proceed to have a party all evening long and talk about it and have potlucks. This is what people are into. And so if you get people excited, it sounds exciting to me. If you capture people's imagination, the policy doesn't really matter, And that's Jackson's story. That's how he wins.